there is a chain, unbroken across 13.8 billion years, that connects the first flash of existence to you, sitting here, now, aware that you exist. Every atom in your body was forged in the heart of a dying star. Every breath you take carries oxygen produced by ancient bacteria that transformed a poisonous atmosphere into one that could sustain complex life. Every thought that moves through your mind emerges from a brain shaped by millions of years of ancestors who survived when others did not. This is not a story of inevitable progress toward humanity. It is a story of accidents and extinctions, of fortunate circumstances compounding across unfathomable stretches of time. For most of Earth's history, nothing like us could have existed. For most of human history, we were not alone. Dozens of other human species walked this planet, made tools, buried their dead, gazed at the same stars. Yet somehow, we are the ones who remain. We are the sole survivors of a crowded family tree, carrying in our DNA the faint traces of cousins who vanished into the darkness of deep time. From the birth of the universe to the emergence of consciousness capable of contemplating its own origins, this is the entire story of how we came to be. Around 13.8 billion years ago, there was no space. There was no time. There was only an infinitely hot, infinitely dense point containing everything that would ever exist. Then it began to expand. We call it the Big Bang, though it wasn't an explosion in any normal sense. Space itself stretched outward in all directions at once, cooling as it grew. Within the first second, the universe went from unimaginably hot to merely millions of degrees. Quarks bound together into protons and neutrons. After 3 minutes, these particles fused into the first atomic nuclei, hydrogen and helium, the simplest elements, the building blocks of everything to come. For 380,000 years, the universe was opaque. Light couldn't travel freely because it kept colliding with charged particles in the cosmic fog. Then, as temperatures dropped below 3,000 degrees, electrons were captured by nuclei to form the first complete atoms. Light could finally move unimpeded. If you could have seen it, the universe would have glowed with the heat of its own creation. But there was no one to see it yet. No planets, no stars, just clouds of hydrogen and helium drifting through the expanding darkness. Gravity changed that. Where the gas was slightly denser, it pulled more material toward itself. Over tens of millions of years, these clouds collapsed inward, growing hotter as they compressed. Eventually, the cores became so hot and dense that hydrogen atoms slammed together with enough force to fuse into helium. Nuclear fusion began. The first stars ignited, flooding the universe with light. These ancient suns were different from our sun. They were made only of hydrogen and helium because nothing heavier existed yet. But inside their cores, fusion continued, building carbon, oxygen, nitrogen, silicon, iron. When the largest of these stars exhausted their fuel, they died in supernova explosions, scattering these new elements across space. It was in these stellar deaths that the heavy elements needed for planets and life were born. The iron in your blood, the calcium in your bones, the oxygen you breathe, All of it was cooked in the furnaces of long-dead stars. Generations of stars lived and died, enriching the universe with heavier elements. Around 9 billion years after the Big Bang, in an unremarkable region of an unremarkable galaxy, a new star began to form from this enriched material. We call it the Sun. 4.5 billion years ago, our solar system was a spinning disk of gas and dust orbiting this young star. The dust grains collided and stuck together, growing into pebbles, then boulders, then mountain-sized objects. Gravity pulled these together into planets. Earth formed in the inner solar system, close enough to the sun to be warm, but not so close that water would boil away. But the early Earth was nothing like the world you know. It was a hellish place, constantly bombarded by asteroids and comets left over from the solar system's formation. The surface was molten rock. The atmosphere was toxic, thick with volcanic gases. There were no oceans, no continents, no life. Then, around 4.4 billion years ago, something massive struck Earth. An object the size of Mars collided with our young planet in a cataclysmic impact that vaporized rock and sent debris spiraling into orbit. This debris coalesced into the moon. The collision tilted Earth's axis, giving us seasons. It may have also helped form our magnetic field, which would later protect life from deadly solar radiation. The planet cooled. Water vapor in the atmosphere condensed into rain. For thousands of years, it rained. The oceans formed, filling the low points in Earth's crust. By 4 billion years ago, our planet had liquid water, the essential ingredient for life as we know it. Somewhere in those ancient seas, chemistry became biology. We don't know exactly how or when, but evidence suggests life emerged surprisingly quickly, perhaps as early as 4.3 billion years ago, though the clearest signs appear around 3.7 billion years ago. Simple molecules began to replicate themselves. They formed protective membranes. They learned to harness chemical energy. The first organisms were single cells, probably similar to modern bacteria, living in the warm, mineral-rich waters near volcanic vents on the ocean floor. They were nothing like you. They had no eyes, no brains, no awareness, but they were alive. They could reproduce. They could evolve. And from that humble beginning, everything else would follow, but not quickly, not easily. What came next was patience on a scale almost impossible to grasp. For the next 3 billion years, life remained simple. Bacteria and their cousins, the archaea, ruled Earth's oceans. They were microscopic, single-celled, and seemed unremarkable. Yet beneath their simplicity, they were revolutionizing the planet in ways that would make all future life possible. Around 3.5 billion years ago, some bacteria evolved a remarkable ability. They learned to capture energy from sunlight and use it to build organic molecules from carbon dioxide and water. This process released oxygen as a waste product. These organisms, called cyanobacteria, would become the most influential life forms in Earth's history. At first, the oxygen they produced didn't accumulate. The early oceans were full of dissolved iron and other elements that reacted with oxygen as soon as it appeared, locking it away in minerals at the ocean floor. For hundreds of millions of years, cyanobacteria pumped oxygen into the water, and the planet absorbed it all. But slowly, the balance shifted. The oxygen sinks became saturated. Around 2.4 billion years ago, oxygen began escaping into the atmosphere in significant amounts. This moment is known as the Great Oxygenation Event, and it was catastrophic for most life on Earth. Oxygen is toxic to organisms that evolved without it. For the anaerobic bacteria that had thrived in Earth's oxygen-free environment, this was an extinction event. The atmosphere that had nurtured them was becoming poisonous. Many species vanished. The survivors retreated to oxygen-free pockets deep in mud, in ocean sediments, in the guts of other organisms. But crisis creates opportunity. Some organisms evolved ways to not just tolerate oxygen, but use it. Aerobic respiration, the process of using oxygen to extract energy from food, produces far more energy than any process available before. It was a game changer. The changing atmosphere triggered another transformation. Somewhere between 1.8 and 2.7 billion years ago, a momentous event occurred. An archaean cell engulfed a bacterium capable of aerobic respiration. Instead of digesting it, the archaean kept it alive. The bacterium provided abundant energy. The host provided protection and resources. Over countless generations, they became inseparable. This partnership gave birth to the eukaryotic cell, the first cell with a nucleus and internal compartments. These new cells were larger, more complex, more capable than anything that came before. Inside them, the captured bacteria became mitochondria, the powerhouses that fuel nearly every complex organism alive today, including you. Eukaryotes changed the rules. Some eventually swallowed photosynthetic cyanobacteria in a similar partnership, acquiring the ability to harvest sunlight. These became the ancestors of all plants and algae. Others remained hunters, consuming whatever they could find. For another billion years, eukaryotes existed as single cells. Then, around 1.7 billion years ago, something new emerged. Cells began sticking together. At first, these were probably simple clusters, barely more organized than a clump of identical individuals. But over time, cells in these groups began specializing. Some focused on reproduction, others on gathering nutrients, others on defense. This was the birth of multicellular life. Not a single event, but a threshold crossed independently in different lineages many times over. The advantages were clear. Larger bodies could move differently, eat differently, survive dangers that would kill a single cell. Multicellular organisms could grow complex structures and develop new ways of living. By around 600 million years ago, Earth's oceans teemed with diverse forms. Seaweeds swayed in the currents. Strange, soft-bodied creatures crawled and drifted. The foundations were laid for an explosion of diversity that would transform the planet once again. But our ancestors were not yet among them. They were still something else entirely, still changing, still waiting for the conditions that would allow them to become what we are. The path from those first bacteria to humans required not just time, but specific circumstances. It required oxygen in the atmosphere. It required complex cells with abundant energy. It required multicellular bodies that could grow large and develop specialized organs. It required, most importantly, that life never completely extinguished itself, despite multiple mass extinctions. despite ice ages that froze the entire planet, despite asteroid impacts and volcanic catastrophes. Every creature alive today, including us, is the product of an unbroken lineage stretching back to those first simple cells. Every one of our ancestors survived long enough to reproduce. Not one link in that chain was broken. When you consider the odds, the violence of Earth's history, the countless ways life could have ended, our existence seems almost impossible. And yet, here we are. 3 billion years after those first bacteria appeared, the stage was finally set for the next act. Animals would evolve. They would crawl onto land, and eventually, one lineage would split from the apes and begin the journey toward humanity. But pinpointing exactly when and how that split occurred has proven to be one of the most difficult puzzles in all of science. Somewhere around 6 to 7 million years ago, in the forests and woodlands of Africa, something changed. A population of apes began evolving in a different direction from the ancestors of modern chimpanzees and bonobos. The fossil record from this crucial period is maddeningly sparse. We have fragments, hints, shadows of what happened, but the full picture remains elusive. What we do know comes from bones buried in sediment, slowly turning to stone over millions of years. These fossils tell us that the transition was not sudden. There was no moment when an ape gave birth to something fundamentally different. Instead, populations slowly diverged, accumulating small changes over thousands of generations until they could no longer interbreed. Some evidence even suggests that after the initial split, these diverging populations continued to encounter each other and exchange genes for millions of years before the separation became final. The earliest candidate for a human ancestor after the split is a creature called Sahelanthropus chadensis. Its remains were discovered in the Jurab Desert of Chad in 2001, far from where scientists expected to find early human relatives. The team, led by French paleontologist Michel Brunet, found a remarkably complete skull, along with some jaw fragments and teeth. They nicknamed the skull Tumai, meaning hope of life in the local language. Tumai lived around 7 million years ago, right at the time when the human and chimpanzee lineages were diverging. The skull is small, with a brain no larger than a modern chimpanzee's. The face is flat, with massive brow ridges jutting out above the eyes. In many ways, it looks like an ape, but there are hints of something different. The canine teeth are smaller than you would expect in a male ape. The position where the spine connects to the skull, called the foramen magnum, sits further forward than in four-legged apes. This forward placement suggests that Sahelanthropus might have held its head upright over an upright body. In 2022, researchers published an analysis of limb bones found at the same site, bones they believe belonged to Sahelanthropus. The femur showed features consistent with walking on two legs. The arm bones, however, looked like those of a tree climber, with powerful muscles for gripping branches. If the interpretation is correct, Sahelanthropus was neither fully bipedal nor fully arboreal. It moved through a world that was itself a mixture, a patchwork environment of forests, palm groves, grasslands, and wetlands. It could walk upright when needed, perhaps while foraging in open areas or wading through shallow water, but it still spent considerable time in the trees, using all four limbs to climb and feed. Yet Sahelanthropus remains controversial. Some scientists argue it might not be a human ancestor at all, but rather an early gorilla or an ape that evolved similar features independently. The fossils are too fragmentary, too few, to say for certain. The truth is, we may never know whether Sahelanthropus was our direct ancestor or a side branch that led nowhere. Around 6 million years ago, another possible ancestor appears in the fossil record. Orrorin tugenensis was discovered in the Tugen Hills of Kenya. Like Sahelanthropus, it is known from only a handful of bones, scattered fragments, 13 pieces in total from at least 5 individuals. The femur, the thigh bone, shows features that suggest bipedalism. The finger bones are curved, indicating climbing ability. Again, we see this dual nature, capable of walking upright, but still at home in the trees. Then, between 4.5 and 4.2 million years ago, comes Ardipithecus ramidus. Discovered in Ethiopia in the 1990s, Ardipithecus is known from more complete remains than either Sahelanthropus or Orrorin. The most famous specimen, nicknamed Ardi, includes much of a skeleton, giving scientists their first detailed look at a very early hominin body plan. Ardi was small, perhaps 4 feet tall, weighing around 110 pounds. She had a brain slightly larger than a chimpanzee's, but still much smaller than a modern human's. Her face was less protruding than an ape's. Her canine teeth were reduced, and crucially, her pelvis and foot bones show clear adaptations for walking upright, though not in quite the same way modern humans do. But Ardipithecus was not simply a primitive version of us. It had long arms and grasping feet with opposable big toes, perfect for climbing. Its hands could move with precision, but were also strong enough to support its weight in trees. It lived in wooded environments, not open grasslands. It represents a way of life that no longer exists, a combination of abilities that seems strange to us now, because nothing alive today moves quite that way. What surprised scientists most about Ardipithecus was what it was not. For decades, researchers had assumed that the last common ancestor of humans and chimpanzees looked essentially like a chimpanzee. They thought our ancestors had evolved from knuckle-walking, tree-swinging apes, similar to those alive today. But Ardipithecus showed that assumption was wrong. Chimpanzees are not living fossils, unchanged representatives of our ancestral state. They have evolved just as much as we have, developing their own specializations, their own unique adaptations. The last common ancestor was something different from both chimpanzees and humans, an animal that moved in ways neither of its descendants do. The environment these early hominins inhabited was changing. The climate was shifting, becoming cooler and drier. In East Africa, the great forests were fragmenting, breaking up into patches separated by more open woodland and grassland. This created new challenges and new opportunities. Walking upright may have been an advantage in this changing world, though the reasons remain debated. Yet despite challenges, bipedalism persisted and spread. By around 4 million years ago, walking upright had become the defining characteristic of our lineage. It was the first major change, appearing millions of years before large brains or sophisticated tools. Our ancestors learned to stand and walk before they learned to think in ways that would distinguish them from other apes. These early creatures, Sahelanthropus, Orrorin, Ardipithecus, remain mysterious. We have so few of their bones. We cannot know what sounds they made, what their social lives were like, how they raised their young. We see them only in fragments, frozen moments from millions of years ago. But what we can see tells us something profound. The split from our ape cousins was not clean. It was messy, gradual, complicated. For millions of years, early hominins existed in a state between, neither fully adapted to life in the trees, nor fully committed to life on the ground. They were experiments in a new way of living, testing the boundaries of what was possible. Most of these experiments failed. Most of these lineages went extinct, leaving no descendants, but some survived. Some continued evolving, and from these survivors would emerge creatures that perfected the art of walking upright, making bipedalism not just possible, but elegant. On November 24, 1974, paleoanthropologist Donald Johanson was surveying a dry gully in the Hadar region of Ethiopia with his graduate student Tom Gray. They had been searching for fossils all morning in the intense heat. Johansen wanted to head back to camp, but Gray suggested checking one more area, a spot they had surveyed before without finding much. Johansen agreed. As they walked across the sun-baked ground, something caught his eye. A piece of arm bone was jutting from a slope. He recognized it immediately as a hominin, one of our ancient relatives. Then he saw another bone, and another, a femur, part of a pelvis, ribs, a lower jaw. They had found a skeleton, not just a few scattered bones, but dozens of pieces from a single individual. This almost never happens. Fossilization requires specific conditions, and bodies usually scatter before they can be preserved. But this individual had been buried quickly, perhaps in a flash flood, allowing much of the skeleton to remain together for over 3 million years. That evening, back at camp, the team celebrated. Someone put on a cassette tape, and the Beatles song "Lucy in the Sky with Diamonds" played over and over. Someone suggested naming the skeleton Lucy. The name stuck. Lucy, officially designated AL2881, is about 40% complete and dates to approximately 3.2 million years ago. She was an adult female, probably in her late teens or early 20s when she died. She stood only about 3.5 feet tall and weighed perhaps 110 pounds. Her skull was small, with a brain no larger than a modern chimpanzee's, around 400 cubic centimeters compared to the 1,400 cubic centimeters of a modern human brain. But her body told a different story than her skull. Her spine curved in an S shape, like ours, not the C shape of a chimpanzee. Her pelvis was short and bowl-shaped, perfectly adapted for balancing the torso over 2 legs instead of 4. Her knee angled inward so her feet could fall in a straight line beneath her center of gravity. Her foot had an arch, providing spring and shock absorption with each step. Every detail of Lucy's lower body showed she was built for walking upright. This wasn't occasional bipedalism, the kind seen in chimpanzees when they stand to reach fruit or carry something. This was obligate bipedalism. Lucy walked upright as her primary form of movement, yet her upper body retained features from an arboreal past. Her arms were relatively long, her fingers were curved, ideal for gripping branches. Her shoulder joints suggested she was still capable of climbing. Recent analyses of her bone structure show she had powerful upper body strength. Lucy could walk, but she probably also spent time in the trees, perhaps sleeping there at night to avoid predators or foraging for fruit during the day. Lucy belonged to a species named Australopithecus afarensis. meaning southern ape from the Afar region. The species was formally described in 1978, based on Lucy and other fossils found both at Hadar and at a site called Leetoli in Tanzania, over 1,500 kilometers away. Australopithecus afarensis lived between approximately 3.9 and 2.9 million years ago. That means the species survived for about 1 million years, twice as long as our species, Homo sapiens, has existed so far. The discovery of Lucy fundamentally changed our understanding of human evolution. Before her, scientists had assumed that brain enlargement came first, that our ancestors developed larger, more intelligent brains, which then allowed them to invent tools and alter their behavior, which eventually led to walking upright. Lucy proved this sequence wrong. Her brain was tiny, no bigger than an ape's, but she walked like a human. Bipedalism came first. Large brains came later. This reordering of events is crucial for understanding how we evolved. Walking upright was not a consequence of being smart. It was a response to environmental pressures, an adaptation that opened up new possibilities, which eventually, millions of years later, would favor the evolution of larger brains. The evidence for upright walking in Australopithecus afarensis goes beyond Lucy's bones. At Leetoli, paleontologist Mary Leakey and her team discovered something extraordinary in 1978. Fossilized footprints preserved in volcanic ash, dating to 3.6 million years ago. The scenario that created these footprints is almost poetic. 3.6 million years ago, a volcano erupted, blanketing the landscape with fine ash. Rain fell, turning the ash into a cement-like consistency. Before it hardened completely, several individuals walked across it, leaving their footprints behind. Then the volcano erupted again, covering the prints with more ash, protecting them. Over millions of years, the ash turned to stone, preserving those footsteps. The trail stretches for 88 feet and contains about 70 impressions. The prints show a heel-strike gait, just like modern humans use when walking. The heel hits the ground first, the weight rolls across the foot, and finally, the toes push off. The big toe is in line with the other toes, not splayed out like a chimpanzee's grasping toe. The foot has an arch. These are not the shuffling, uncertain steps of a creature just learning to walk upright. These are the confident footprints of beings for whom bipedalism was natural, ingrained, perfected over countless generations. Someone walked across that ash 3.6 million years ago, probably not thinking about the act of walking any more than you think about it now. And their steps survived, frozen in stone, waiting to tell us their story. Interestingly, recent research revealed something unexpected about those footprints. In 1976, before the famous trackway was discovered, Leakey's team found another set of prints at a nearby location, designated Site A. These prints were strange, wider than the others, with an unusual cross-stepping gait where one foot moved in front of the other. Some researchers initially thought they might be bear prints, but when scientists re-excavated and analyzed them in 2019, they confirmed these two were made by a bipedal hominin, but one with a different foot shape and walking style than the Australopithecus afarensis tracks. This suggests that 3.6 million years ago, multiple species of upright walking hominins lived in the same area at the same time. The story of human evolution is not a simple line from ape to human. It's a branching tree with many limbs, most of which led nowhere. For millions of years, Earth was populated by multiple types of upright walkers, different experiments in bipedalism, each adapted to slightly different ecological niches. What was life like for Australopithecus afarensis? They lived in a changing Africa, a world in transition. The climate was becoming cooler and drier. Dense forests were fragmenting into a mosaic of woodlands, grasslands, and gallery forests along rivers. This patchwork environment may have been key to their success. They could exploit multiple habitats, feeding on fruits and leaves in the trees, gathering seeds and roots on the ground, perhaps scavenging meat from carcasses when the opportunity arose. They probably lived in small groups, like many primates do. At Hadar, in 1975, researchers discovered a collection of fossils from at least 13 individuals, including 4 children, all deposited at the same location. This group became known as the First Family, though we can't know if they were actually related. Some disaster overcame them all at once, killing and burying them together. Perhaps they drowned in a flash flood. Perhaps they succumbed to disease. Their bones provide tantalizing evidence of how Australopithecus afarensis lived in social groups, but the specifics of their social structure remain mysterious. One striking feature of Australopithecus afarensis is sexual dimorphism, the difference in size between males and females. Males were significantly larger than females, perhaps 50% heavier. In modern primates, pronounced size differences usually indicate a social structure where males compete aggressively for access to multiple females. If the same pattern held for Australopithecus afarensis, males might have fought each other for dominance and mating rights, while females formed the stable core of social groups, raising their young cooperatively. Life was dangerous. Large predators roamed the African landscape: saber-toothed cats, giant hyenas, leopards. Australopithecus afarensis was prey. They were small, vulnerable, lacking the speed of antelopes or the strength of buffalo. Their best defenses were vigilance, social cohesion, and the ability to climb trees quickly when threatened. Many probably died young, taken by predators. Those who survived into adulthood faced constant risk. Lucy herself probably died when she was still relatively young, likely in her late teens or early 20s, though she was fully adult with her wisdom teeth erupted. In 2016, researchers studying her bones found evidence of fractures consistent with a fall from height. She may have fallen from a tree, suffering injuries that led to her death. It's a sobering reminder that life for our early ancestors was precarious, every day a struggle for survival. Yet despite these challenges, Australopithecus afarensis thrived for 1 million years across a vast region of East Africa. They were not just surviving, but succeeding. Their body plan worked. Walking upright had given them an advantage, and they exploited it fully. Why did bipedalism succeed? There are many theories. Walking upright exposes less body surface to the intense midday sun, helping with temperature regulation. It allows you to see over tall grass, spotting predators and resources from farther away. It frees your hands to carry things, whether food, tools, or infants. It's more energy efficient for long-distance travel than knuckle walking or quadrupedalism. Probably all these factors played a role, creating multiple overlapping advantages that made bipedalism worth the trade-offs. What's certain is that by the time of Australopithecus afarensis, bipedalism was firmly established. The experiment had succeeded. Our ancestors were committed to walking upright. This single adaptation would shape everything that followed. It changed the way they interacted with their environment. It changed the way they used their hands. It created new selective pressures that would eventually lead to bigger brains, tool use, language, and all the other features that make us human. Lucy walked across the African landscape 3.2 million years ago, leaving footprints that have long since vanished. But her legacy remains, written in her bones, in the Laetoli footprints, in every step you take. When you walk, you are using a body plan that was perfected millions of years before the first humans existed. You are continuing a journey that began when some distant ancestor first stood upright and saw the world from a new perspective. The journey was far from over. Australopithecus afarensis would give rise to other species, some remaining small and ape-like, others evolving in a radically different direction. One of those lines would develop larger brains and begin making tools. They would become the first members of our genus. They would become Homo. The transition happened gradually, somewhere around 2.8 million years ago in East Africa. The fossil record from this period is frustratingly sparse, just fragments and hints scattered across time. But what we do have tells a story of profound change. In 2013, graduate student Chalachu Seyum was surveying the Lady Jararu research area in Ethiopia's Afar region when he spotted something weathering out of a hillside. It was a partial jawbone, still containing several teeth. The sediments surrounding it were carefully dated using multiple techniques. The jaw was 2.8 million years old, making it the oldest fossil yet discovered that can be confidently assigned to the genus Homo. The jawbone, catalogued as LD 350-1, is a transitional form. Its teeth are smaller and differently shaped than those of Australopithecus, more suited to a changing diet. The jawbone itself is slimmer, less robust, yet it still carries primitive features linking it to older ancestors. It stands at the threshold between what came before and what would follow. What makes something Homo rather than Australopithecus? The genus Homo is defined by slightly larger brains, smaller teeth, and jaws, and a body plan increasingly adapted for life on the ground. Most importantly, members of Homo began making and using stone tools in ways that changed their relationship with the environment. Around the same time LD 350-1 was alive, something remarkable was happening at sites across East Africa. Someone was deliberately striking stones together, creating sharp-edged flakes that could cut through hide and sinew. At Gona, Ethiopia, archaeologists have found stone tools dating to 2.6 million years ago. At Olduvai Gorge in Tanzania, thousands more tools appear in layers from slightly later periods. These are called Oldowan tools, named after Olduvai. They seem simple at first glance, just stones with a few flakes removed. But creating one requires understanding that striking two rocks together at the right angle with the right force will produce a sharp edge. It requires planning, foresight, and precise motor control. Not every rock will work. You need to select the right type of stone, hold it properly, aim carefully. Someone figured this out. And then they taught others. The knowledge spread. By 2.4 million years ago, stone tools were common across East Africa. For decades, scientists assumed these tools were made by the species Homo habilis, meaning handy man. The first Homo habilis fossils were discovered at Olduvai Gorge in 1960 by Jonathan Leakey, son of the famous paleontologists Louis and Mary Leakey. The find included part of a skull, a lower jaw with teeth, and remarkably, several bones from a hand. The hand bones showed that this creature could grip objects precisely, with an opposable thumb and fingers capable of delicate manipulation. When Louis Leakey, Philip Tobias, and John Napier officially named the species in 1964, they argued it represented a major step forward in human evolution. Here was a creature with a brain slightly larger than an Australopithecines, around 600 cubic centimeters, and hands capable of crafting tools. They found it alongside thousands of stone implements. It seemed obvious that this was the toolmaker, but science rarely offers such neat answers. As more discoveries emerged, the picture grew more complicated. In 2015, researchers announced they had found stone tools dating to 3.3 million years ago at a site called Lomekwi, near Lake Turkana in Kenya. These tools are older than any fossil of the genus Homo. Someone before Homo, probably an Australopithecine, was already making stone tools. In 2023, excavations at Nyayanga in Kenya uncovered even more surprising evidence. Alongside Oldowan tools nearly 3 million years old, researchers found fossils of Paranthropus, a different lineage of hominins with massive jaws and huge grinding teeth, completely unlike Homo. Paranthropus had always been seen as a specialist, adapted for eating tough plant materials. Yet here they were, associated with tools and butchered animal bones. The lesson is humbling. Tool use did not define Homo. Multiple species were experimenting with technology at the same time. What distinguished Homo was not that they invented tools, but that they relied on them more extensively, integrated them more deeply into their way of life, and eventually developed them into something more sophisticated. Homo habilis lived from approximately 2.4 to 1.6 million years ago. They were small, between 3 and 4 feet tall, weighing perhaps 70 to 90 pounds. Males were substantially larger than females. Their brains, while bigger than Australopithecines, were still quite modest by modern standards, ranging from 500 to just over 800 cubic centimeters, depending on the individual. The skeleton of Homo habilis, known mainly from a fragmentary specimen called OH62, discovered in 1986, shows a creature still partially adapted for climbing. The arms were relatively long compared to the legs, the fingers curved. The proportions resembled a smaller, more primitive body plan than what would come later. They walked upright, certainly, but may still have spent significant time in trees, perhaps sleeping there for safety. Their faces were flatter than Australopithecines, with smaller teeth and less prominent jaws, but they still had heavy brow ridges and protruding faces. They were not yet us, but they were moving in that direction. The environment they inhabited was changing. Between 3 and 2 million years ago, Earth's climate was cooling and drying. In East Africa, forests contracted, grasslands expanded. The comfortable woodland mosaic that had sustained Australopithecines for millions of years was fragmenting, becoming more open, more challenging. This environmental pressure may have driven the evolution of Homo. Creatures that could extract more calories from their surroundings, that could process tougher foods or access new food sources, would have an advantage. Stone tools provided exactly that advantage. With a sharp flake, you can butcher a carcass efficiently, cutting through thick hide to reach the meat and marrow inside. Cut marks on fossil bones from 2.6 million years ago show that early Homo was doing exactly this, using stone tools to deflesh animal bones. We don't know if they were hunting or scavenging, probably both. They may have driven carnivores off fresh kills, using their numbers and tools to claim meat they couldn't have obtained otherwise. They may have ambushed young or weak animals. Either way, meat became a more important part of their diet. Meat is calorie-dense, providing more energy than an equivalent weight of plants. It contains proteins and fats essential for brain growth. And brain growth was already beginning. In 2015, researchers digitally reconstructed the skull of the original Homo habilis specimen, OH7, using CT scanning technology. Their reconstruction suggested a brain volume of around 800 cubic centimeters, considerably larger than previous estimates. If correct, this means Homo habilis had achieved a brain size overlapping with later species that appeared around 2 million years ago. This raises an intriguing possibility. Perhaps the common ancestor of multiple Homo species already had a relatively large brain. Perhaps brain enlargement happened earlier than we thought, setting the stage for everything that followed. Because by 2 million years ago, multiple species of Homo coexisted in Africa. There was Homo habilis, still relatively small and primitive. There was Homo rudolfensis, with an even larger, flatter face and bigger brain. And there was something new, something more advanced. Homo erectus. Homo erectus changed everything. They were taller, with a body plan that looked fundamentally modern for the first time. They had long legs built for efficient walking and running. Their arms were shorter, no longer suited for climbing. Their brains averaged nearly 900 cubic centimeters, with some individuals reaching over 1,000. They were the first members of our lineage who, if you dressed them in modern clothes and passed them on the street, might not immediately stand out as different. The earliest confirmed Homo erectus fossils in Africa date to just under 2 million years ago. They appear suddenly in the fossil record, already quite different from what came before. Some researchers argue that Homo erectus evolved from Homo habilis in Africa, a straightforward progression, but others point out that the transition seems too abrupt, that there must be missing fossils we haven't found yet, showing intermediate forms. What we do know is that Homo erectus spread rapidly, and not just across Africa. They became the first hominins to leave the African continent in significant numbers, establishing populations thousands of miles away from their origins. In 1991, excavations at Dmanisi, in the modern country of Georgia, at the southeastern edge of Europe, uncovered something astonishing: hominin fossils dating to around 1.8 million years ago. Over the following decades, researchers found more bones, eventually recovering parts of at least 5 individuals, along with numerous stone tools and animal bones. The Dmanisi hominins are the oldest confirmed members of our genus, found outside Africa. They lived in a world dramatically different from tropical Africa, a temperate environment with cold winters. The landscape was wooded but open, populated by saber-toothed cats, giant cheetahs, ostriches, and large herbivores. The hominins were living alongside these animals, somehow surviving in an ecosystem where they were not the dominant predators. The Dmanisi fossils are fascinating because they show tremendous variation. Some individuals had larger brains, others smaller. Some had more primitive features, others more advanced. This variation has led to intense debate. Are these all Homo erectus, or do they represent multiple species? Some researchers even proposed naming them a separate species, Homo georgicus, though most scientists now include them within Homo erectus. What drove them to leave Africa? The simplest answer is that they followed the food. Around 2 million years ago, climate fluctuations created cycles of wet and dry periods. During wetter times, grasslands and the animals that fed on them expanded northward out of Africa, into the Middle East and beyond. Homo erectus, now capable of exploiting these grassland environments, followed the migrating herds. They weren't planning to colonize new continents. They were simply moving to where the food was, generation after generation, until they had traveled thousands of miles from their ancestral homelands. By 1.6 to 1.8 million years ago, Homo erectus had reached Indonesia, a journey of over 10,000 miles from East Africa. Fossils from Java show they had crossed vast distances, navigated different environments, adapted to tropical islands far from where they evolved. Other populations moved into China, where they would persist for over 1 million years. This dispersal is remarkable. In less than 200,000 years, Homo erectus went from being confined to Africa to inhabiting much of the Old World. No hominin had ever achieved anything close to that geographic range, and they did it with relatively simple stone tools, no fire that we can confirm, no sophisticated clothing or shelter. Their success suggests something important about what it means to be Homo. It's not just about brain size or tool use. It's about behavioral flexibility, the ability to adapt to new conditions, to learn and to innovate when faced with challenges. Homo erectus possessed this flexibility in ways their ancestors did not. They could survive in forests, grasslands, and temperate woodlands. They could endure both scorching heat and freezing winters. They were generalists, capable of making a living almost anywhere. For over 1.5 million years, Homo erectus populations spread across 3 continents. They evolved regional variations, adapting to local conditions. Some populations developed more sophisticated tools, creating teardrop-shaped hand axes that required more skill to produce than simple oldowan flakes. Others continued using simpler technologies that worked well enough for their needs. They were our ancestors. Not directly, perhaps, because the lineages that led to modern humans were still in Africa during this time, but Homo erectus was part of the story. They proved that hominins could leave Africa and survive. They expanded the range of environments humans could occupy. They set the stage for later migrations and dispersals, and they demonstrated something profound, that once a certain threshold was crossed, once brains grew large enough, and bodies adapted well enough, and social groups became cooperative enough, humans could go anywhere. The planet was now open to us. The genus Homo had emerged, and with that emergence came a new kind of creature, one that would not simply adapt to its environment through biological evolution, but would begin reshaping the environment to suit itself. The journey toward modern humanity had truly begun. But the journey from there to us was far from straightforward. For hundreds of thousands of years, the planet hosted multiple species of humans living side by side, each adapted to different places, each finding their own way to survive. This was not a ladder with us at the top. It was a branching tree, thick with diversity, most of whose branches would wither and die, leaving only one surviving lineage, ours. Around 700,000 years ago, a new species emerged that would become particularly important to our story. They are called Homo heidelbergensis, named after the German town of Heidelberg, where the first fossil, a massive jaw, was discovered in 1907 by workers digging sand from a pit near Mauer. The Mauer jaw is striking. It's exceptionally thick and broad, lacking a chin, clearly not modern, but the teeth are surprisingly small for such a robust mandible. This combination of primitive and advanced features would define the species, creatures caught between what came before and what would follow. Homo heidelbergensis spread into Europe by 700,000 years ago, and their settlements became more permanent by 500,000 years ago. These humans had brains averaging 1,100 to 1,400 cubic centimeters, approaching the size of modern human brains. Their faces were still heavy, with prominent brow ridges, but less extreme than Homo erectus. Their noses were more vertical, more like ours. Evidence from the site of Gisher Benot Yaakov in Israel suggests Homo heidelbergensis controlled fire by building hearths as early as 790,000 years ago. Fire changed everything. It provided warmth in the cold nights. It kept predators at bay. It allowed humans to cook food, making it easier to digest and extracting more calories and nutrients. Around the hearth, people could gather after dark, sharing food and stories, building the social bonds that made them stronger. Homo heidelbergensis was also the first human species to build simple shelters, with evidence from the site of Terra Amata in France. They were hunters of large game. Remains of animals such as wild deer, horses, elephants, hippos, and rhinos with butchery marks have been found at sites with Homo heidelbergensis. Bringing down an elephant or rhinoceros requires planning, cooperation, and courage. These were sophisticated hunters working in coordinated groups. But Homo heidelbergensis presents a taxonomic puzzle. The fossils assigned to this species come from both Africa and Europe, spanning hundreds of thousands of years, showing tremendous variation. Some researchers question whether they all belong to a single species, or whether we're lumping together what should be distinct lineages. Comparison of Neanderthal and modern human DNA suggests the two lineages diverged from a common ancestor, most likely Homo heidelbergensis, sometime between 350,000 and 400,000 years ago, with the European branch leading to Neanderthals and the African branch to Homo sapiens. This split between populations in Africa and Europe marked a crucial moment. Around 300,000 years ago, climate shifts made the Sahara Desert a formidable barrier. African and European populations became isolated from each other. In their separate worlds, they evolved along different paths. In Europe, Homo heidelbergensis populations adapted to the brutal climate of the Ice Age. By 400,000 years ago, the Neanderthal lineage was already well established in Europe. Over time, they developed the distinctive features we recognize as Neanderthal: stocky, cold-adapted bodies, large noses for warming frigid air, tremendous physical strength. The first recognized Neanderthal fossil was discovered in 1856 in the Neander Valley in Germany. Workers quarrying limestone in a cave found strange bones. Scientists at the time didn't know what to make of them. The skull was clearly human, but different. The brow ridges were massive. The skull was long and low. For decades, Neanderthals were portrayed as brutish, primitive, barely more than apes. But this image was based on a misunderstanding. In 1908, the first nearly complete Neanderthal skeleton was found at La Chapelle-aux-Saints in France, and because the individual suffered from degenerative joint disease, the skeleton was originally reconstructed as stooped over, cementing an incorrect image of Neanderthals as slouching creatures. Later analysis corrected this mistake. Neanderthals stood upright, like us. The Neanderthal species ranged widely in Eurasia, from Portugal and Wales in the west, across to the Altai Mountains of Siberia in the east. They were remarkably adaptable. Neanderthal populations lived in cold steppe environments in England and Siberia about 60,000 years ago, and in warm, temperate woodlands in Spain and Italy about 120,000 years ago. Neanderthals had brains as large as, or larger than ours. They made sophisticated stone tools. There is evidence that Neanderthals were specialized seasonal hunters, eating animals that were available at the time, such as reindeer in winter and red deer in summer. They hunted with wooden spears, taking down large and dangerous prey. When they lived near coasts, they exploited marine resources such as mollusks, seals, dolphins, and fish. Archaeological evidence shows that some Neanderthals cared for their sick and buried their dead. At sites across Europe and the Middle East, Neanderthal burials have been found, sometimes with the body positioned carefully, sometimes with stones placed around it. Whether these represent true burial rituals with symbolic meaning remains debated, but they show, at minimum, that Neanderthals treated their dead with care. But while Neanderthals thrived in Europe and Western Asia, another group of humans was evolving in eastern regions, though they remained hidden from science until very recently. In 2008, Russian archaeologists working in Denisova Cave in Siberia's Altai Mountains found a tiny finger bone from a juvenile. When DNA was extracted and analyzed in 2010, it revealed something astonishing. This individual belonged to a previously unknown group of humans, genetically distinct from both modern humans and Neanderthals. They were named Denisovans, after the cave where they were discovered. The Denisovans are closely related to Neanderthals, sharing a common ancestor, and both groups are sister lineages to modern humans. But while Neanderthals are known from thousands of fossils, the Denisovans remain mysterious. Only 5 small and highly fragmented fossils had been identified as Denisovans based on DNA analyses by 2020, all from Denisova Cave. Yet their genetic legacy is enormous. DNA analysis estimates that about 4.8% of the genomes of Melanesians derive from Denisovans. Denisovan DNA is also found in indigenous Australians, Papua New Guineans, and East and Southeast Asians. This widespread genetic signature suggests Denisovans ranged across vast areas of Asia, even though we have almost no fossils to prove it. The oldest Denisovan fossils from Denisova Cave date to around 200,000 years ago. The cave was periodically inhabited by both Denisovans and Neanderthals. In 2018, researchers announced something extraordinary: a bone fragment designated Denisova. 11 belonged to a 13-year-old female who had a Neanderthal mother and a Denisovan father. She was a first-generation hybrid, direct evidence that when these two groups encountered each other, they sometimes mated. Analysis of DNA from soil layers in Denisova Cave showed that modern humans arrived there about 45,000 years ago, with DNA from all three human groups present in the same sediment layer. 3 species of humans used the same cave over hundreds of thousands of years. They may never have met face to face, but they walked the same passages, lived in the same chambers, looked out at the same mountains. While these large-brained humans spread across the continents, something entirely unexpected was happening on a remote island in Southeast Asia. In 2003, an Australian-Indonesian team excavating Liang Bua Cave on the island of Flores in Indonesia made a discovery that shocked the scientific world. They found the remains of an individual who would have stood only about 1.1 meters, approximately 3 feet 7 inches tall. The skeleton was nearly complete, including a skull. The skull was tiny, with a brain about 400 cubic centimeters, similar to a chimpanzee. The teeth were large for such a small skull. The arms were long. The feet were disproportionately large, more than half the length of the thigh bones. The individual, designated LB1, is estimated to have weighed only 25 kilograms, about 55 pounds. The discoverers named the species Homo floresiensis. The media immediately dubbed them hobbits. As of 2015, partial skeletons of 15 individuals have been recovered from Liang Bua Cave. The fossils of Homo floresiensis date to between about 100,000 and 60,000 years ago, with stone tools made by this species dating to between about 190,000 and 50,000 years old. Despite their small body and brain size, Homo floresiensis made and used stone tools, hunted small elephants and large rodents, and coped with predators such as giant Komodo dragons. Stone tools found at other sites on Flores show that humans arrived on the island at least 1 million years ago, though how they crossed the treacherous seas to reach this isolated island remains unknown. The short stature of Homo floresiensis was likely due to insular dwarfism, an evolutionary process where size decreases as a response to fewer resources in an island ecosystem. Many animals isolated on islands evolve smaller bodies. With limited food and no large predators to defend against, being small becomes an advantage. You need less food. You can survive on what the island provides. In 2024, researchers announced they had found even older Homo floresiensis fossils at a site called Mata Menge, about 70 kilometers from Liang Bua. Analysis of a tiny arm bone fragment dating to 700,000 years ago suggests the ancestors of the hobbits were even shorter, about 1 meter tall, just over 3 feet. These ancient fossils show features similar to Homo erectus from Java, suggesting Homo floresiensis descended from that species, but underwent dramatic body size reduction after arriving on Flores. Homo floresiensis survived on their remote island for hundreds of thousands of years. They became extinct around 50,000 years ago, just before or at the time when Homo sapiens arrived in the region. Whether modern humans caused their extinction or whether they simply missed each other by a few thousand years remains unknown. Local legends in Flores speak of the Ebu Gogo, small, hairy cave dwellers, raising the tantalizing possibility that hobbits survived long enough to be remembered in oral tradition, though this remains speculation. By 50,000 years ago, the world was full of different kinds of humans. Neanderthals controlled Europe and Western Asia. Denisovans ranged across Eastern Asia. Homo floresiensis lived on Flores. Homo erectus may have still persisted in isolated pockets, and somewhere in Africa, a new species was emerging, one that would eventually outlast all the others. The human mosaic was rich and varied. Different species, different adaptations, different ways of being human. For hundreds of thousands of years, we were not alone. We were part of a diverse family, many branches on the same tree. But that diversity would not last. One by one, the other branches would fall away, and only we would remain. But before we could outlast the others, we had to begin. Somewhere in Africa, during a period of dramatic climate swings and environmental upheaval, our species took its first breath. The story of that beginning has been rewritten multiple times as new fossils emerge from the African earth. For decades, scientists believed Homo sapiens arose in East Africa around 200,000 years ago, in a relatively small population that eventually spread across the continent and then the world. But recent discoveries have revealed a far more complex and ancient origin. In 1961, miners searching for barite, a mineral used in drilling operations, stumbled upon a cave at Jebel Irhoud in Morocco, about 100 kilometers west of Marrakesh. Inside, they found a remarkably complete skull. At first, with its large brain but elongated shape, it was assumed to be an African Neanderthal. Later analysis suggested it might be an archaic human, perhaps Homo heidelbergensis. The skull sat in museums and journals, studied but not fully understood, its true significance unrecognized. Decades passed. In 2004, French paleoanthropologist Jean-Jacques Houblin, who had begun his career studying a jaw from the same site, received funding to reopen the now collapsed cave. His team carefully excavated the remaining intact sediment layers, hoping to better understand the site's age and its place in human history. What they found exceeded all expectations. The team unearthed new partial skulls, jaws, teeth, and limb bones from at least 5 individuals, including a child and an adolescent. Using thermoluminescence dating on heated flint tools found in the same layer as the bones, they determined an age that shocked the scientific world, approximately 300 to 315,000 years old. In 2017, when the findings were published in the journal Nature, they pushed back the origin of Homo sapiens by 100,000 years. The Jebel Irhoud fossils, dating to roughly 300,000 years ago, are now considered the oldest securely dated evidence of our species. But what made these fossils Homo sapiens? Their faces were remarkably modern, flat, tucked under the skull rather than jutting forward. The brow ridges were relatively thin. The teeth, while large, were shaped like ours. When researchers compared the facial structure to other hominins using sophisticated statistical analysis, the Jebel Irhoud specimens clustered with modern humans, not with Neanderthals or more archaic species. Yet the back of the skull told a different story. The brain case was elongated, low, archaic. A virtual reconstruction showed that while the face would look familiar to us, the skull shape was distinctly primitive. This combination, a modern face paired with an archaic brain case, suggests that our species did not emerge suddenly, fully formed. We evolved in stages. The Jebel Irhoud fossils suggest that faces evolved modern features before the skull and brain took on the globular shape seen in later fossils and in living people. The face came first. Only later did the brain, and perhaps the mind, catch up. The discoveries at Jebel Irhoud fundamentally changed how scientists think about human origins. As paleoanthropologist Jean-Jacques Hublin explained, the evidence suggests that early Homo sapiens spread across the entire African continent around 300,000 years ago, with different regions contributing to the emergence of modern humans. There was no single cradle, no one place where humanity was born. Africa itself was the cradle, the entire continent a vast workshop where populations separated by geography and brought together by climate change mixed, diverged, and evolved. The Jebel Irhoud people lived in a very different Morocco than exists today. The climate was wetter. The landscape was a mixture of open grasslands and scattered trees, with gallery forests along river. Large animals roamed the region: gazelles, wildebeest, zebras, rhinoceros, and predators to hunt them. The stone tools found with the fossils are Middle Stone Age technology, more sophisticated than the simple flakes of earlier periods. These tools required planning and skill to create. What were these early Homo sapiens like? In many ways, they were still transitional. Their brains were large, around 1,300 cubic centimeters, approaching modern human averages. But the shape of those brains suggests they may not have functioned quite like ours. The parts of the brain associated with complex social cognition and symbolic thought might not have been fully developed. They could make tools, hunt large game, and survive in challenging environments. But whether they thought like we do, whether they had language, art, ritual, remains unknown. Other early Homo sapiens fossils have been found across Africa, filling in pieces of the puzzle. In Ethiopia, 2 sites have yielded crucial evidence. At Herto, in the Great Rift Valley, researchers discovered skulls dating to about 160,000 years ago. These were initially designated as a subspecies, Homo sapiens idaltu, meaning elder, because while clearly modern humans, they showed some archaic features. More importantly, at Omo Kibish, also in Ethiopia, Richard Leakey's team found fossil bones in 1967. For decades, these Omo fossils were thought to be around 130,000 years old. But in 2004, improved dating techniques revealed they were far older. The Omo fossils were dated to approximately 196,000 years ago. Then in 2022, further analysis pushed that date even earlier to a minimum of approximately 233,000 years old. The Omo fossils include 2 individuals. Omo 1 appears thoroughly modern, with a high, rounded skull and a face that would not look out of place today. Homo, too, found at the same level, and therefore the same age, looks more primitive, with a lower, longer skull. This difference suggests that when modern humans first appeared, there was considerable morphological diversity, with less modern-looking populations living alongside more modern ones. This diversity makes sense when you consider the environment of the time. Between 300 and 200,000 years ago, Africa's climate was incredibly volatile. Ice age cycles in the northern hemisphere drove dramatic shifts across the continent. Wet periods alternated with severe droughts. Forests expanded and contracted. Lakes filled and dried. The Sahara Desert itself pulsed, sometimes greening into savanna, other times expanding into an impassable barrier. These climate swings fragmented populations. Groups became isolated from each other during dry periods, evolving in their own directions. When wet periods returned, populations could expand their ranges, meeting and interbreeding with groups they hadn't encountered in thousands of years. This pattern of isolation and reconnection, repeated over hundreds of thousands of years, created a complex genetic and morphological mix. Homo sapiens was not born from a single population in a single place. We emerged from a web of populations spread across Africa, evolving modern features at different times and in different combinations, mixing their genes when environmental conditions allowed. Some populations contributed genes for brain shape, others for body proportions, still others for adaptations to local climates or diets. What made us Homo sapiens, then, was not any single feature but a constellation of traits that gradually assembled over hundreds of thousands of years. Reduced facial projection, smaller teeth and jaws, a more vertical forehead, a rounded, globular skull, lighter, more gracile skeletons, and perhaps most importantly, though we cannot see it in fossils, changes in how our brains were wired, changes that would eventually enable the symbolic thought, complex language, and cultural transmission that define humanity. By 200,000 years ago, populations across Africa were starting to look recognizably like modern humans. Their skulls had the right shape. Their faces would fit in a crowd today. But behaviorally, they were still different from us. And in Africa, surrounded by other human species, some of which had larger brains or stronger bodies or longer histories, our ancestors were learning to live in a world that was constantly changing. They were adapting not just to one environment, but to the challenge of environmental instability itself. That flexibility, that ability to adjust and survive when conditions shifted, would prove to be our greatest advantage. The world was full of humans, but we would be the ones who learned to thrive anywhere, who could remake ourselves when necessary, who could imagine possibilities that didn't yet exist, and then bring them into being. We had arrived, but our journey was just beginning, and that journey would take us far beyond the continent where we were born, across deserts and mountains and oceans, into lands our ancestors had never seen. It would bring us face to face with other kinds of humans, and it would change us forever. We had arrived, but our journey was just beginning, and that journey would take us far beyond the continent where we were born, across deserts and mountains and oceans, into lands our ancestors had never seen. It would bring us face to face with other kinds of humans, and it would change us forever. The story of when and how modern humans left Africa has been rewritten many times. For years, scientists believed there was a single great migration around 70 to 60,000 years ago, but the truth is more complicated. There were false starts. Fossils from Mislia Cave in Israel date to around 185,000 years ago. Stone tools in Arabia and India suggest humans reached these places between 80 and 70,000 years ago. In Laos, bones from Tam Pa Ling Cave date to between 86 and 68,000 years ago. But most of these early pioneers left no descendants in modern populations. The migration that truly changed everything happened later. The main dispersal occurred between 70 and 50,000 years ago, following the southern route along the coastlines of Asia. What drove them to leave? Climate likely played a crucial role. Between 110,000 and 60,000 years ago, cycles of warm and cold periods turned the Sahara and Arabian deserts green during warm phases. Animals migrated north. Humans followed. These migrations worked in both directions, with populations moving between Africa and Eurasia. Humans were not setting out to colonize continents. They were following food, moving where game was plentiful. Over generations, this carried them thousands of miles from their origins. The route they took remains debated. One likely path led through the Sinai Peninsula into the Middle East. Another may have crossed the southern Red Sea when sea levels dropped during ice ages. By around 65 to 50,000 years ago, modern humans had reached Australia, requiring boats or rafts to cross open ocean. Europe was populated later, around 45 to 40,000 years ago. The humans who entered Europe encountered a colder landscape with shorter winter days and new plants and animals. When modern humans arrived, the two species met. For thousands of years, scientists debated whether modern humans and Neanderthals had interbred. Early DNA studies in the 1990s seemed to suggest they had not. But in 2010, the first complete Neanderthal genome was sequenced, revealing that Neanderthal DNA was found in the genomes of people outside Africa, accounting for 1 to 4% of their genetic makeup. Recent studies published in late 2024 have pinpointed when this mixing occurred with unprecedented precision. The interbreeding began about 50,500 years ago and continued for approximately 7,000 years, ending around 43,500 years ago. The average date for Neanderthal gene flow into modern human populations is around 47,000 years ago. This was not a single chance encounter. This was prolonged coexistence. Archaeological evidence shows modern humans and Neanderthals lived side by side in Eurasia for 6,000 to 7,000 years. They occupied the same landscapes, hunted the same animals, perhaps even sheltered in the same caves at different times. When modern humans left Africa and encountered Neanderthals in environments completely foreign to them, they were entering cold lands with different diseases and dangers. Neanderthals had lived there for hundreds of thousands of years. Their immune systems evolved to fight local viruses. When the two species interbred, modern humans inherited genetic tools that helped them combat viral infections common in Eurasia. Some Neanderthal genes helped with climate adaptation and unfamiliar foods. The interbreeding was about survival, borrowing already adapted genes that gave modern humans a crucial advantage. Not all Neanderthal genes were beneficial. Some regions of the modern human genome have almost no Neanderthal DNA, suggesting harmful effects. Natural selection preserved useful genes while weeding out disadvantageous ones. Interestingly, modern humans also contributed genes to Neanderthals, with evidence showing gene flow from humans to Neanderthals as far back as 100,000 years ago. The mixing went both ways, though the details of how and when remain complex and still debated. Modern humans also encountered Denisovans, though exactly where remains unclear. Interbreeding occurred around 44,000 to 54,000 years ago. Today, about 4.8% of Melanesian genomes derive from Denisovans, with smaller amounts in other Asian and Oceanian populations. The encounters between modern humans and these other human species fundamentally shaped who we are. Approximately 20% of the Neanderthal genome survives scattered across modern human populations. No individual carries all of it, but collectively, humanity has preserved a substantial portion of Neanderthal genetic diversity, even though Neanderthals themselves went extinct. Why did we survive while they did not? Neanderthals had larger brains and were stronger, better adapted to cold. Denisovans thrived in harsh mountains, yet both went extinct while we spread across the globe. Perhaps it was not any single advantage, but a combination of traits. Modern humans may have had more efficient communication, allowing larger social networks. We may have been better at innovating. Our population sizes appear to have been larger, giving us more resilience, or perhaps timing and luck. When climate shifted dramatically around 40,000 years ago, maybe Neanderthal populations were already declining and could not recover, while modern human populations in Africa and the Middle East remained large enough to weather the crisis. We will likely never know for certain. What we do know is that by around 40,000 years ago, modern humans had spread across Africa, the Middle East, Asia, and were entering Europe and Australia. By 30,000 years ago, Neanderthals were gone. The last known Neanderthal fossils date to around 40,000 years ago, though they may have persisted in isolated pockets for a few thousand years longer. Homo floresiensis disappeared from Flores around 50,000 years ago, right when modern humans were arriving in the region. Homo erectus populations in Java may have lasted until around 143,000 years ago, though this is debated. One by one, the other human species vanished. By around 30,000 years ago, we were alone. After millions of years of multiple human species sharing the planet, after hundreds of thousands of years when you could walk through parts of Europe or Asia and encounter completely different kinds of humans, only one species remained: us. The world that had once been full of human diversity became a world where only Homo sapiens survived, and the DNA of those extinct relatives, woven into our genomes, became the only physical trace of their existence, carried forward in our blood as we continued the journey they could not complete. We had left Africa. We had met our cousins and learned from them. We had watched them disappear. And now, with the entire planet stretching before us, with no other human species to compete with, or learn from or encounter in the wilderness, we would have to figure out what it meant to be human entirely on our own. The change did not happen all at once. Over tens of thousands of years, something shifted. Humans began creating things that served no practical purpose, burying their dead with care, marking their bodies and possessions. They began to think symbolically, understanding that one thing could represent another. The earliest hints of this symbolic thinking appear surprisingly early in Africa. At Blombos Cave in South Africa, researchers discovered pieces of ochre engraved with geometric patterns dating back about 100,000 years, part of a tradition continuing for over 30,000 years. These are not accidental marks, but required planning and intention. At the same site, archaeologists found shells carefully pierced with holes, dated to 75,000 years ago. Each shell was pierced using a bone tool, then strung and worn. These were jewelry, expressions of identity. Similar discoveries emerged from other African sites, like Deep Kloof Rock Shelter, where ostrich eggshell fragments bear engraved patterns that evolved over thousands of years. Burials provide another window into evolving consciousness. At Panga ya Saidi in Kenya, researchers discovered the burial of a child, now called Mtoto, dated to 78,000 years ago, the oldest known human burial in Africa. The child was placed in a fetal position in a specially dug grave, likely wrapped in a shroud, with what appeared to be a pillow beneath the head. Even earlier burials exist outside Africa. At Kafze in Israel, remains dated to around 100,000 years ago were found with 71 pieces of red ochre, suggesting the pigment played a role in burial rituals. But while these early African and Middle Eastern sites show the beginnings of symbolic thought, it was in Europe where this behavior exploded into something unmistakable, something that still takes our breath away today. On December 18th, 1994, 3 French cave explorers, Jean-Marie Chauvet, Eliette Brunel, and Christian Hilaire, were following their passion for underground exploration in the Ardèche region of southeastern France. They discovered an opening that led into a vast cave system now known as Chauvet Cave. What they found inside would change our understanding of Ice Age art. The walls were covered with paintings, not crude stick figures or simple handprints, but sophisticated, naturalistic depictions of animals rendered with stunning artistic skill. The ancient artists drew lifelike beasts that seemed to gallop, crawl, and frolic through the cave's chambers, including a triptych where 50 drawings of horses, lions, and reindeer cavort across 49 feet of limestone wall. When the paintings were first dated, many assumed they must be relatively recent, but radiocarbon dating revealed humans used Chauvet Cave during 2 periods, 37,000 to 33,500 years ago, and 31,000 to 28,000 years ago. The oldest painting dates to around 36,500 years ago. This was revolutionary. When modern humans first entered Europe, they already possessed fully developed artistic traditions. The earliest known art in Europe is also some of the most sophisticated. 14 animal species are represented: woolly rhinoceroses, mammoths, cave bears, cave lions, horses, bison, reindeer, red deer, ibex, aurochs, panthers, and even an owl. Many are predators, dangerous animals humans did not typically hunt. This was not documentary art recording meals. It was symbolic, perhaps spiritual. The artists used the cave's natural features brilliantly. Bulges in limestone became the shoulder of a bison. Working by flickering lamplight, they created illusions of movement, what some have called prehistoric cinema. One bison was drawn with 8 legs to show it running. Red ochre handprints dot the walls. Enigmatic displays include a bare cranium placed on an altar-like pedestal, and a phallic column where a woman's painted legs and vulva blend into a bison's head, suggesting these places held religious significance. About 20,000 years later, humans created the paintings at Lascaux Cave, discovered by French teenagers in September 1940. Dating to around 21,000 years ago, Lascaux contains about 600 wall paintings and 1,500 engravings, showing animals in motion with a sense of depth and narrative. But why create these paintings? The caves were not living spaces. People went there specifically to create art, sometimes traveling deep into the earth, into complete darkness, bringing materials, ochre, charcoal, animal fat for lamps, scaffolding to reach high walls. The effort was enormous. One theory suggests the caves functioned as sacred spaces where the boundary between physical and spiritual worlds grew thin. Another possibility is they served as places of initiation where young people learned essential stories and knowledge. Or perhaps it was simply art for art's sake, humans expressing an innate need to create beauty that would outlast their brief lives. We will likely never know. But these paintings represent a transformation in human consciousness. The people who created them were thinking abstractly, planning for the future, believing their actions had meaning beyond survival. This artistic explosion was accompanied by innovations. At Sunghir in Russia, burials dating to between 30 and 34,000 years ago contain over 13,000 ivory beads, pierced fox canines, ivory spears, and red ochre. The beads alone represent over a year of full-time work, an astonishing investment for the dead. Tools became more sophisticated. Stone blades required years of training to master. Bone was carved into needles for sewing fitted clothing. Fishing equipment appeared. Projectile points became aerodynamic. Innovation accelerated. And somewhere in this period, complex syntactic language emerged, capable of conveying abstract concepts, telling stories, teaching complicated skills, discussing things not immediately present. Language and symbolic thought reinforce each other, creating culture in the fullest sense. Complex traditions maintained across generations, stories told and retold, knowledge accumulating over centuries. This was the cognitive revolution, the moment when humans became behaviorally modern, developing the full suite of capabilities that define us: language, art, music, ritual, complex social structures, technological innovation, and the ability to think about thinking itself. It emerged gradually over tens of thousands of years, but by 30,000 years ago, all the pieces were in place. Humans were creating art, burying their dead with elaborate rituals, wearing jewelry, making sophisticated tools, and almost certainly telling stories around fires. They were us. If you could travel back to Sungir or Chauvet and meet these people, you would recognize them immediately. They thought like us. They felt like us. They were capable of everything we are capable of, every emotion, every insight, every creative leap. The long evolutionary journey that began with simple bacteria 3.5 billion years ago, that continued through fish and amphibians and early mammals, that saw our ancestors leave the trees and walk upright, that witnessed brain size triple over 2 million years, had finally produced a creature capable of wondering about its own origins. We had become modern. We had become human in the fullest sense. And with that transformation complete, there was no limit to what we could achieve, no environment we could not adapt to, no challenge we could not meet. The final chapter of our biological evolution was closing. The age of cultural evolution was beginning. For most of human history, we lived as our ancestors had for countless generations. We moved with the seasons, following game, gathering wild plants, fishing in rivers and coasts. We lived in small bands of a few dozen people. Our possessions were what we could carry. Our homes were temporary. This way of life was not primitive. Hunter-gatherers work fewer hours than people in agricultural societies. They have diverse diets, deep environmental knowledge, rich social lives, and leisure time for storytelling, music, and art. For hundreds of thousands of years, this worked. But around 12,000 years ago, something changed. In scattered locations across the world, people began planting seeds, tending crops, staying in one place. They became farmers. The transformation unfolded over thousands of years in multiple regions independently. But once it began, there was no going back. Earth's climate stabilized around 12,000 years ago, following the last ice age. The warming brought milder weather and longer growing seasons. In regions where useful plants grew abundantly, people who had been harvesting them for generations began to notice patterns. The first place with clear evidence was the Fertile Crescent, covering parts of modern Turkey, Iraq, and Iran. This crescent-shaped area was blessed with wild ancestors of wheat and barley, plants with large, nutritious seeds that could be stored. Evidence from Choga Golan in Iran shows cultivation dating to 12,000 years ago, with domesticated wheat by 9,800 years ago. At sites across the region, archaeologists found grinding stones, storage pits, and permanent houses. Domestication was gradual. Wild wheat shatters when ripe, scattering seeds. Early farmers selected for mutant plants whose seeds stayed on the stalk longer, saving these seeds to plant next year. Over generations, wheat evolved to suit human needs. Animal domestication followed, with cattle, goats, sheep, and pigs, all domesticated between 13,000 and 10,000 years ago. These animals provided meat, milk, leather, and wool. They could pull plows, making larger fields possible. Agriculture emerged independently in other regions. In China, rice and millet farming dates to the same period. In Mesoamerica, people domesticated maize, beans, and squash. In Africa, sorghum and yams. In South America, potatoes and quinoa. But why did people make this change? Farming is more work than hunting and gathering. Early farmers spent long hours tilling soil, weeding fields, and processing grain. Their diets became less diverse. Several theories attempt to explain the transition, including population pressure, climate changes at the end of the Ice Age, and a 2025 study suggesting catastrophic wildfires and soil erosion may have driven the shift. Farming produced surplus food that could be stored. This surplus freed some people from food production, allowing specialization. Some became potters, making vessels to store grain. Others became toolmakers, crafting better hoes and sickles. Still others became traders, exchanging surplus crops for goods from distant regions. Division of labor emerged, and with it, social hierarchy. Villages appeared with permanent homes. People invested in their fields, building irrigation systems that would benefit their children. Population grew because settled farmers can have children more frequently than nomadic hunter-gatherers who must carry infants during migrations. More children meant more hands to work fields, which meant more food, which supported even larger populations. By around 6,500 years ago, some villages had grown into cities. The earliest appeared in Mesopotamia, between the Tigris and Euphrates rivers. Uruk, founded around 5,000 years ago, grew to 30,000 to 40,000 residents, with up to 90,000 in surrounding areas. By around 3,200 years ago, Uruk was the largest settlement in southern Mesopotamia, dominated by monumental mud brick buildings decorated with mosaics. Massive temples called ziggurats towered over the city, serving as both religious buildings and administrative centers. The world's earliest known texts come from Sumerian cities like Uruk, dating to between around 3,350 and 2,500 years ago. These were accounting records, simple pictographs, recording grain stores, sheep herds, and worker rations. Writing was invented for bureaucracy, but that bureaucratic tool would become something more. Once people could record information externally, knowledge could accumulate across generations. A farmer could write which crops grew best. An astronomer could record star movements over decades. A king could issue consistent laws. Writing changed human consciousness, allowing us to build on the discoveries of those before us. Cities required organization on unprecedented scale. Thousands of people needed rules, leadership, systems for resolving disputes and distributing resources. Kings emerged, claiming divine right to rule, commanding armies, collecting taxes, building monuments. Civilization had arrived. And with writing came something unprecedented. For the first time, humans could preserve their thoughts beyond a single lifetime. The farmer's knowledge, the priest's prayers, the king's decrees, all could be pressed into clay and saved. Stories that once lived only in memory could now be read by people born generations later. This was the threshold. Before writing, everything humanity knew had to pass through the fragile chain of human memory. Now knowledge could accumulate, build upon itself, compound across centuries. The agricultural revolution had changed how we lived. Writing changed how we thought. By 5,000 years ago, the biological journey was essentially complete. Our bodies had reached their modern form hundreds of thousands of years earlier. Our minds had awakened to symbolic thought tens of thousands of years before. And now, with cities and writing, we had created systems that would carry human knowledge forward, independent of any single person or generation. The story that began 13.8 billion years ago in an infinitely hot point had led here, through the formation of stars and planets, through the first stirrings of life in ancient oceans, through fish that crawled onto land and mammals that took to the trees, through apes that learned to walk upright, through the slow growth of brains and the gradual awakening of consciousness, through ice ages and migrations, through meetings with other human species now gone, through the development of language and art and ritual. All of it led to this moment when a Sumerian scribe pressed a reed into wet clay and created marks that we can still read today, when humans could finally write down their own story. Prehistory was ending. Recorded history was beginning. And from this point forward, the story of humanity would be written by humans themselves, preserved in their own words, passed down through the ages in symbols we invented to capture what we wanted remembered. The journey from star stuff to storytellers was complete. What came next would be up to us.